Why governments are drowning in debt and pretend it's fine. Right now, governments around the world owe more money than at any point in human history, and here's the wild part. Most of them are acting like this is completely normal. Some countries owe more than their entire economy produces in a year. Yet politicians still go on television promising new projects, tax cuts, and spending plans like the bill never arrives. Imagine maxing out your credit card, taking another one, and then celebrating because the bank still lets you swipe. That is basically where global government debt sits today, and whether you care about economics or not, this quietly affects your job, your savings, and how expensive life feels every single year. So today, we are breaking down why governments are drowning in debt, how they keep pretending it is fine, and what this means in the real world. Without panic, without jargon, just the truth most people never hear explained properly. Easy money era. For most of modern history, government debt came with real consequences. Borrowing money was expensive, interest rates were high, and taking on too much debt could quickly spiral into a serious national problem. That reality forced governments to be careful, because debt was something you felt immediately. Then, central banks changed the rules. Interest rates were pushed lower and lower to stimulate growth, protect markets, and avoid recessions. Over time, borrowing stopped feeling dangerous and started feeling convenient. When money is cheap, the urgency to ask hard questions disappears, and debt becomes easier to justify. As this environment continued, governments adjusted their behavior around it. Instead of treating debt as a last resort, it became a first response. Economic slowdown meant borrowing. Political pressure meant borrowing. Any problem that needed solving could be softened by issuing more debt. Investors supported this system because government bonds were seen as safe, and as long as interest payments stayed manageable, no one had a reason to panic. The entire system quietly agreed to pretend that low rates would last forever. The deeper issue is that this era reshaped expectations. Citizens became used to government stepping in with financial support, bailouts, and stimulus whenever things went wrong. That expectation reinforced even more borrowing. When interest rates stayed low for years, it created the illusion that debt no longer mattered, that it could grow indefinitely without consequences. But debt does not disappear. It waits. When rates rise, even slightly, the cost of maintaining massive debt piles explodes, and suddenly money that once felt free demands attention. This is where the trap forms. Governments become dependent on low interest rates to survive their own debt levels. Raising rates to fight inflation or stabilize currency now threatens budgets directly. What once looked like smart policy becomes a constraint, and the longer the easy money era lasted, the harder it became to exit without pain. Political short-term thinking. Another major reason government debt keeps rising is the way political systems are designed. Most governments operate on short election cycles, and those cycles reward immediate results, not long-term responsibility. Borrowing allows leaders to promise benefits today without asking voters to pay the full cost right now. The rewards are instant, the consequences are delayed, and delayed consequences rarely influence elections. Over time, this creates a predictable pattern. Politicians campaign on discipline, responsibility, and reform, but once in office, they face pressure to spend. Cutting programs or raising taxes creates backlash, slows growth, and risks political survival. Borrowing, on the other hand, keeps everyone relatively comfortable in the short term. It avoids difficult conversations and pushes financial pain into the future, where someone else will have to deal with it. This mindset slowly becomes normalized across parties and ideologies. No matter who wins, the incentives remain the same. Each new government inherits massive debt and chooses to manage it rather than reduce it, because reducing it would require visible sacrifice. Debt grows not because leaders are ignorant, but because the system quietly discourages restraint and rewards expansion. The long-term risk is that policy becomes focused on appearances rather than durability. Growth fueled by borrowing looks healthy on paper, even when it rests on unstable foundations. Governments celebrate strong numbers while ignoring how much debt is holding everything together. As long as the system does not break, there is little motivation to change it. Economic crises stack up. The final reason governments are drowning in debt is that modern economies are hit by repeated crises with almost no recovery time in between. Financial crashes, global health emergencies, wars, energy shocks, and supply chain breakdowns all demand immediate government action. In those moments, borrowing feels justified, even necessary. Few people argue against spending when the alternative looks worse. The problem is not responding to crises, it is what happens afterward. Debt accumulated during emergencies is rarely paid down during calm periods. Instead, temporary measures become permanent, and spending levels remain elevated even when conditions improve. By the time the next crisis hits, governments are already carrying heavy debt loads, leaving them with fewer options and less flexibility. Each crisis adds another layer to the debt structure. Borrowing stacks on top of borrowing, and the economy grows around it rather than beyond it. Governments assume future growth will eventually make everything manageable, but repeated disruptions prevent that growth from fully materializing. The result is a system that looks stable, but is increasingly fragile underneath. As debt accumulates, even small shocks become more dangerous. Interest rate changes, inflation spikes, or market uncertainty can ripple through government finances faster than before. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean the margin for error keeps shrinking. Governments continue forward not because the system is strong, but because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. Central banks and the illusion of control. Central banks sit at the center of the global debt story, and for years they have projected an image of precision and control. By adjusting interest rates, buying government bonds, and injecting liquidity into financial systems, they are supposed to keep inflation stable, growth steady, and crises contained. For a long time, this appeared to work. Markets responded predictably, governments borrowed comfortably, and economic shocks were softened before they turned into full collapses. This created a powerful belief that central banks could always step in and fix whatever went wrong. As debt levels climbed, central banks became more deeply intertwined with government finances. Large-scale bond purchases made borrowing cheaper and reassured investors that governments would always find buyers for their debt. This blurred the line between monetary policy and fiscal support. Instead of acting as distant referees, central banks became active participants in keeping debt manageable. The illusion begins to crack when central banks face competing pressures. Raising interest rates to fight inflation increases the cost of servicing government debt. Keeping rates low to protect budgets risks fueling inflation and weakening currencies. Every decision now carries trade-offs that did not exist when debt levels were smaller. The tools still work, but their effectiveness is reduced and their side effects are harder to ignore. What makes this dangerous is not incompetence, but confidence. The belief that central banks can always stabilize the system encourages more risk-taking from governments and markets alike. When everyone assumes control exists, caution fades. The system becomes dependent on continued intervention, and that dependence grows quietly until intervention itself becomes the risk. Debt to grow the economy. One of the strongest arguments for rising government debt is that it helps grow the economy. Borrowing allows governments to invest in infrastructure, education, technology, and social programs that can raise productivity and living standards. In theory, if the economy grows faster than the debt, borrowing pays for itself. This logic has guided policy for decades and has worked under the right conditions. The problem appears when debt is used to maintain growth rather than create it. Instead of funding long-term productive investments, borrowing increasingly supports consumption, short-term stimulus, and existing obligations. Growth continues, but it becomes more fragile, relying on constant injections of borrowed money. The economy moves forward, but only as long as borrowing continues. This shifts the relationship between debt and growth. Rather than debt serving the economy begins to serve the debt. Governments focus on keeping growth just strong enough to manage interest payments and maintain confidence. Structural reforms and difficult adjustments are delayed because borrowing offers a temporary alternative. The danger is subtle. The economy does not collapse, it slows quietly. Productivity gains weaken, inequality can widen, and future growth potential erodes. Debt-fueled expansion looks healthy on the surface, but underneath, it reduces resilience. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to generate real growth without borrowing even more. Why markets still trust governments? Despite record debt levels, financial markets continue to lend to governments with remarkable confidence. Investors still buy government bonds, often at low yields, because states are viewed as the safest borrowers in the system. Governments can tax, control currency, and operate indefinitely, which makes default seem unlikely. This trust forms the backbone of the modern financial system. Another reason markets remain calm is comparison. When private debt looks riskier and global uncertainty rises, government bonds appear stable by contrast. Even heavily indebted countries benefit from this dynamic, especially when central banks stand ready to intervene. As long as bonds remain liquid and payments continue, markets focus more on short-term stability than long-term sustainability. This trust also relies heavily on precedent. Major economies have carried large debts before and avoided collapse, reinforcing the belief that they always will. Each crisis that passes without disaster strengthens confidence, even if the underlying risks grow. The absence of immediate consequences becomes evidence that the system works, rather than a warning that pressure is building. The risk is that market trust can change faster than policy can adapt. Confidence depends on expectations, and expectations can shift suddenly. As long as markets believe governments are in control, borrowing remains easy. But when doubt appears, it does not arrive gradually. Understanding why trust exists is important, because it explains how debt can grow so large without triggering alarm, right up until the moment it does. Inflation as a pressure release valve. Inflation plays a quiet but central role in how governments manage massive debt, even when it is rarely described that way openly. When prices rise over time, the real value of money declines, and that decline affects debt as well. Governments repay old obligations with currency that is worth less than when the debt was created. On paper, nothing dramatic happens. Payments are made, bonds mature, and the system keeps moving. This makes inflation politically convenient. Raising taxes or cutting spending creates immediate resistance, but inflation spreads the cost across the entire economy in a way that feels indirect. Prices rise, wages adjust unevenly, and purchasing power erodes quietly. The connection between government debt and higher living costs is rarely obvious in the moment. Inflation does not arrive as a bill in the mail. It shows up in groceries, rent, and everyday expenses, making it easier to tolerate and harder to trace back to policy choices. Central banks often frame inflation as a technical problem to be managed, but in a high debt world, it also functions as a release valve. Allowing prices to rise moderately can ease fiscal pressure by shrinking the real value of debt relative to the economy. The challenge is that inflation rarely stays neatly contained. What makes this balance difficult is that inflation helps debt in theory but hurts credibility in practice. Too much inflation erodes trust in currency and policy institutions. Too little leaves debt burdens intact. Governments walk a narrow path, relying on inflation to do quiet work in the background while insisting they are fully in control of it. Why debt feels abstract to most people. One reason government debt continues to grow with limited public pushback is that it feels distant and abstract to most people. Unlike personal debt, national borrowing does not come with monthly statements or direct collection calls. The numbers are so large that they lose meaning, and the consequences unfold slowly. When debt rises, daily life does not change immediately, which makes it easy to ignore. Debt is also hidden behind layers of institutions and terminology. Bonds, deficits, monetary policy, and fiscal balances sound technical and disconnected from real life. This creates a gap between cause and effect. People feel rising costs or economic pressure, but they rarely associate those experiences with government borrowing decisions made years earlier. Without a clear link, concern fades. Another reason debt feels unreal is that governments do not face the same constraints individuals do. They do not retire, they do not move, and they do not die. They roll over debt continuously, replacing old obligations with new ones. As long as payments are made and services continue, debt appears manageable. This creates the impression that debt is not a problem until something visibly breaks. The danger of abstraction is complacency. When debt feels like someone else's problem, it becomes easier for it to grow unchecked. Understanding debt requires connecting slow, subtle effects to long-term decisions. Without that connection, borrowing remains politically easy and publicly tolerable. Is it actually sustainable? The question that hangs over all of this is whether the current debt trajectory is sustainable. The honest answer depends on conditions staying favorable. As long as economies grow, interest rates remain manageable, and markets maintain confidence, governments can continue to operate with high debt levels. Sustainability in this sense does not mean debt goes away. It means the system avoids crisis. The problem is that sustainability built on assumptions is fragile. Growth can slow. Rates can rise. Confidence can shift. High debt reduces flexibility, making it harder to respond when conditions change. Policies that once worked become risky when margins are thin. The system can function for a long time, but its tolerance for error shrinks. Historically, high debt periods have ended in a few predictable ways. Growth outpaces debt, inflation erodes its value, restructuring occurs, or some combination of all three. Rarely does debt simply resolve itself without adjustment. The absence of immediate crisis often delays necessary changes, increasing the scale of adjustment later. So sustainability is less about whether governments can survive today and more about what they are giving up tomorrow. High debt can be managed, but it comes at the cost of resilience. Understanding that trade-off matters because it explains why governments appear calm even as risks quietly accumulate, hidden liabilities and off-balance sheet debt. Government debt figures often look large on their own, but they rarely tell the full story. Beyond official numbers sit vast obligations that do not always appear in headline debt statistics. Pension promises, healthcare commitments, loan guarantees, and support for state-owned entities represent future payments that governments are expected to honor. These obligations are real, even if they are not counted the same way as traditional borrowing. They sit quietly in the background, accumulating over time. Because these liabilities are spread far into the future, they attract less attention. Payments may not come due for decades, making them easy to postpone or underestimate. Politicians can promise benefits today without fully accounting for their long-term cost. What looks manageable today can become overwhelming later. Off-balance sheet commitments also reduce transparency. Citizens and even policymakers may underestimate the true scale of government obligations because the numbers are fragmented across different programs and institutions. This fragmentation makes it harder to assess risk accurately. Debt appears under control while long-term pressures quietly build beneath the surface. The danger is not deception, but delay. These liabilities will eventually demand funding. When they do, governments may have fewer options, especially if traditional debt is already high. Understanding hidden obligations matters because they shape future budgets long before they become visible crises. Demographics and aging populations. Demographic change is one of the most powerful and least flexible forces affecting government debt. In many countries, populations are aging rapidly, with fewer working-age people supporting a growing number of retirees. This shift places increasing pressure on public pensions, healthcare systems, and social services. At the same time, the tax base grows more slowly, making it harder to fund these commitments without borrowing. Unlike economic cycles, demographic trends unfold slowly, but predictably. Governments know these changes are coming, yet adjusting policy to match them is politically difficult. Reducing benefits or raising retirement ages sparks resistance, while maintaining current promises requires more spending. Borrowing becomes the easiest way to bridge the gap, especially when the full impact lies years ahead. An aging population also affects economic growth itself. Slower labor force growth can reduce productivity and innovation, limiting the economy's ability to outgrow debt. This creates a feedback loop where rising obligations meet slower growth, increasing reliance on borrowing to maintain stability. Over time, demographics transform debt from a temporary response into a structural feature of government finances. The challenge is not sudden collapse, but long-term pressure that steadily narrows policy options. Global debt interdependence. Government debt does not exist in isolation. In a globalized financial system, countries are deeply interconnected through trade, investment, and capital flows. One nation's debt is often another nation's asset. Pension funds, banks, and central institutions across the world hold government bonds, tying financial stability to continued trust in sovereign borrowers. This interdependence creates stability in normal times, but risk during stress. When confidence in one major borrower weakens, the effects ripple outward. Markets reassess risk across regions, borrowing costs rise, and currencies shift. Global institutions and alliances further complicate this web. Support mechanisms, currency arrangements, and coordinated policies can reduce immediate fallout, but they also encourage higher debt by reinforcing the belief that no major government will be allowed to fail. This shared expectation keeps borrowing costs low, but it increases systemic exposure. The global nature of debt means problems are rarely contained. Stability depends not just on individual governments, but on collective confidence in the system as a whole. What happens when confidence breaks? Confidence is the invisible foundation supporting government debt. As long as investors believe governments can manage their obligations, borrowing remains easy and markets stay calm. Interest rates reflect trust more than numbers alone. This is why debt can grow for years without obvious consequences. The system functions on belief as much as balance sheets. When confidence weakens, change can be abrupt. Investors demand higher returns to compensate for perceived risk, increasing borrowing costs almost overnight. Governments are forced to allocate more resources to interest payments, leaving less for public services or economic support. What once felt manageable becomes restrictive very quickly. The most challenging aspect of confidence loss is speed. Policy adjustments take time, but markets react instantly. By the time corrective measures are implemented, conditions may already be worse. This gap between reaction and response magnifies stress and limits options. Confidence does not break easily, but when it does, recovery is difficult. Rebuilding trust requires consistency, credibility, and often sacrifice. Understanding this dynamic explains why governments work so hard to project calm, even when debt levels are high. Rising interest costs. One of the most immediate and unavoidable pressures on government debt comes from interest payments themselves. As debt levels climb, the portion of the budget dedicated simply to servicing that debt grows as well. When interest rates are low, governments can borrow cheaply and payments remain manageable. But once rates rise, even modestly, the cost of maintaining existing debt can increase dramatically. Money that might have gone to infrastructure, education, or social programs instead flows to creditors, leaving less flexibility for policy priorities. The challenge is compounded because debt is cumulative. Interest payments are calculated on the total borrowed, so as debt grows, small rate changes have magnified effects. Even historically low rates that rise only a few percentage points can transform what was manageable into a major fiscal constraint. Governments are forced to make hard choices, cut spending, raise taxes, or borrow even more to cover interest, each with its own economic and political consequences. Rising interest costs also create a feedback loop. Higher payments reduce room for growth-oriented investments, potentially slowing economic expansion, which in turn makes debt harder to manage. At the same time, markets watch carefully. If investors sense rising fiscal strain, borrowing costs may increase further, creating additional pressure. What started as a small shift in rates can cascade into a much larger financial challenge. Long-term, these dynamics mean that even governments considered stable must constantly monitor rates and debt levels. It is not enough to manage current obligations. Maintaining flexibility for future crises depends on keeping interest costs under control. Rising rates are not just numbers, they are a silent, powerful force that shapes policy decisions and economic outcomes every year. Limits of taxation. Taxes are the primary tool governments have to fund obligations, but they are far from limitless. Raising tax revenue can provide temporary relief for debt, but excessive taxation creates political backlash and economic friction. Higher taxes can slow growth, reduce consumption, and discourage investment, which may ironically make debt harder to manage over time. The balance between funding obligations and sustaining economic vitality is delicate and increasingly difficult in high-debt economies. There is also a psychological limit to taxation. Citizens can tolerate gradual increases or modest adjustments, but sharp hikes are often met with protest or resistance. Politicians recognize this, which is why borrowing frequently becomes a preferred solution over aggressive tax increases. Taxes can reduce debt, but politically and socially, they are much harder to implement than continuing to borrow in a world where interest rates remain manageable. Another complication is that taxes alone cannot address structural debt drivers such as aging populations or growing entitlement programs. Even if governments capture a larger share of national income, the underlying pressures may still exceed what taxation can realistically cover. Borrowing, therefore, is not just convenient, it is sometimes seen as unavoidable when obligations grow faster than revenue. Ultimately, taxation is a blunt instrument. It works in theory to pay down debt or fund programs, but it is constrained by politics, economics, and social tolerance. Governments must juggle between generating revenue, maintaining economic health, and managing debt expectations. When taxes reach their limit, borrowing often becomes the only remaining lever to keep the system functioning. What this means for you. Understanding government debt is not about fear, it is about awareness. This shapes inflation, taxes, job markets, and how stable economies feel over time. Staying informed helps you make better personal decisions, from saving to investing to career choices. If this breakdown helped connect dots you never saw before, hit like so more people actually see content like this. Subscribe if you want clear explanations without noise, and share this with someone who still thinks government debt is just a number on a screen. The more people understand how this works, the less power pretending has.